going on, y'all? Welcome back to another episode. I'm Swipa Cam. Welcome back to the channel. Y'all already know I got one of my absolute favorite media personality, writers, communicators, analysts, interviewers, the man with the great head of hair himself, Ryan Blackburn.
Oh man, what up, Swipa? Well, wonderful intro. It's great to be back on the show. You've done some great things. You're killing it yourself. Let's get down to it, man. I'm so excited.
Yeah, bro. First off, man, I just want to say congratulations, bro. Like, when I heard about the news that you were moving to Mile High Sports, bro, I was just elated. Number one, because you already know you do great work, you create great content. You're by far one of the most beloved figures in the entire Denver Nuggets universe, man. Like, people love your work, they love your personality, the way you talk to people, how you engage, even on Twitter Spaces and doing questions for people, the mailbag. Like I said, and you already know this, I've said this before, I've been listening to your podcast way before I ever started the channel, man. So just congratulations on your success, man. Can you just tell us, man, like what can people expect from you now that you're moving into Mile High Sports, and how has the transition been so far? I mean, it just happened, really 7 days ago.
Well, first of all, thank you. A lot of kind words there, and I do my best to understand my roots and where I came from and where I was back when I was 19 years old, and looking up to certain writers that were doing their own thing and making sure to interact with the people themselves. And I try to emulate that the best way I can. A lot of what I do and a lot of what I'm going to continue to do is very similar. I'm going to continue to do some reporting, continue to do some analysis. The podcast Pickaxe and Roll is staying the same. There's going to be some multimedia stuff that's coming down the pipeline, and there's some stuff with Mile High Sports that I'm excited about that can't necessarily leak yet, but we're hoping to be able to leak soon. It should be a lot of fun, man. But most of it's going to be the same for everybody that loved the content that I did before. You're going to get a lot of the same stuff now.
Bet. Well, man, first off, again, it's going to be great. I can't wait to see the new projects and stuff that you have coming out. Mile High Sports doing some crazy things, man. They hired Cody Rourke, obviously, and then, now they brought you on. I mean, bro, I'm really excited to see the content that both of you are going to put out, but obviously you, especially with the Nuggets, man. I mean, again, congrats on the opportunity, man. This is going to be huge, and I know we're going to have even more great content to look forward to in the future, bro. So, man, let's go ahead and just get started. I know everybody thinking about the same thing I'm thinking about, bro. So we just had the Josh Kroenke interview. Now, it had been put off, I want to say, twice due to COVID, I believe. I believe Josh Kroenke and then some of the other staff members got COVID. So before we kind of dive into some of the nitty gritty and some of the things he said specifically, what was your overall takeaway from the press conference with Josh Kroenke in lieu of Tim Connelly's exit to the Minnesota Timberwolves?
Well, the biggest one was, holy crap, there's so much here. There's so much stuff to be able to talk about, because the last time that Josh Kroenke spoke was about 5 years ago. And he probably needs to speak more, because there were so many things, and every little thing that he said was put under a microscope, because there were so many things of value that he said and hadn't said before. Good Lord. But I'm really excited to share some of these, because it does seem to me like Josh Kroenke wanted to get out in front of some of the criticisms that he had been, that the Nuggets had been undergoing, that KSC had been undergoing with regard to the Tim Connelly stuff. He was very visibly upset, or at least frustrated in that way. And I'm not really surprised, honestly, because the phrasing that he used with regard to the Minnesota Timberwolves was, we're not a startup, as in the Nuggets. They opened up the side door basically with some of the conversations. He was very affronted, is how I would describe him. And I'm not really surprised, because Tim and Josh have been friends for 9 years, and the way that the Minnesota Timberwolves sort of handled their business was very cold-hearted.
Yeah, and I think that was some of this I took away was, it seemed that he was defensive, and maybe not defensive in a sense of he was lashing out per se, but defensive as in his demeanor walking into that press conference was, I'm going to defend our position and why we've done what we've done, why we did what we did. But even with the Tim Connelly situation, to your point, the language he utilized, talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves like a desperation move, even some of the seemingly the shock around Tim Connelly, like taking this deal, like and sometimes he even inferred like the amount of money that Tim received that somehow left him like almost flustered, like he couldn't really think, like he couldn't really process like what was happening, right? And so I feel like for myself, he had the option after the third year on his deal. Tim Connelly did. And so it seems that was he under the impression that Tim was going to use that option to then re-up with the Nuggets. So say like they're doing really well, they're really successful, and he's being paid at a below market value for what a president of basketball operation would be being paid. So then it would seem like the idea was that like he was supposed to come back to the Cronkies and say, hey, I'm doing really well. My deal, I'm being paid very low. I want to go ahead and put that option into play, and then maybe we can renegotiate the contract. And then so for Minnesota to come in at the end of that third year, and then he exercises that contract and then leaves for no compensation, did you feel like that he was bothered by the process, like of how and why that happened?
It's interesting. He might have been bothered. There's no doubt in my mind that that's something that he feels. Whether he should feel that way or not, I'm not really certain. I think that there are definitely reasons for him to be more proactive in this case, knowing that Tim Connelly was a fantastic executive, that he had been underpaid for several years now, and was now getting to the point where he deserved to be paid like one of the top executives in the NBA. Now, the Minnesota Timberwolves offer, it was wild. It was very much out there. This is game-breaking stuff with the way that they are throwing around equity, phantom equity, as Josh Kroenke was describing it. And there were some curious factors here as to whether this was actually like a stake in the ownership versus some other bonus tied to the franchise valuation. I think it's the latter. But it does seem like Josh is trying to kind of shirk away the responsibility of this, push that away. And when he had the opportunity to re-up with Tim on his end has said ad nauseum that he did not want to leave Denver. That even at the Minnesota Timberwolves press conference where he was being introduced, he said he never wanted to leave the Nuggets. That was never something he was hoping to do. So I do think that there's a possibility that Tim may not have come back to Josh with a fully excited way of just being like, hey, I would love to re-up with the Nuggets right now. I think that there is a possibility there that Tim then had a little bit of a wandering eye once the option came out. But a lot of the reason for that is because there were other teams that were going to treat him better, and he knew it, and everybody in the building knew it too.
Yeah, and he mentions that he took flack for hiring Tim Connelly initially, and then now he's taking flack for not paying him and Tim Connelly leaving. And so I do think that the Cronkies, Josh, deserve some credit for being able to go from Masai Ujiri, who is clearly one of the three best executives in the NBA, and then now obviously hires Tim Connelly. Tim Connelly struggled for the first couple of years, but ever since, he's been largely great. Some people in the Nuggets community are upset about the OG Anunoby pass, or the Tyler Lydon draft, or holding on for players too long. So I get that. But again, if you take what he's done and then you compare it and stack it up to other GMs in the NBA, even from big moves, signing Nikola Jokic, signing Jamal Murray, drafting Michael Porter Jr. and getting what you got out of him so far, building the overall roster, finding the Maliks, finding the Jared Vanderbilts. Even finding Juancho in them, Monte Morris. They've done a great job for the most part. So I know people aren't like sold on everything he's done, but if you look at what he's done in totality, Tim has a very impressive resume. And not only that, as a culture setter, his reputation, not just with the Nuggets, but seemingly around the NBA, is exquisite. People love him. And so that's one of the things that the Minnesota Timberwolves were buying into. So they offered him essentially that $40 million deal over 5 years, I believe. Is that how much it was? It was 5 years, $40 million?
Yeah, so that was kind of the base package of it. And then there's supposed to be some franchise valuation after it. It's a large contract. It's a creative contract, something that other teams haven't really done.
Right. So, you add that in there. But this is my thing, Ryan. When you value people, you show them, like you pay them. You don't keep coming back to the table saying, 3 years down the line, I've been underpaid. My contract coming up. Why would you not deal with that right then and there instead of waiting? So I think that's probably been my frustration with this process, is you knew this was coming. You knew he's taking you to a Western Conference Finals. You knew that he assimilated this team. He got Aaron Gordon. They made it to the playoff. They've been a top 3 seed prior to this, and they were obviously, with all the injuries, still made it to the playoffs and got 48 wins. You knew this was coming, and then for you not to maybe have the foresight to get this deal done, it just seemed like they either just completely misstepped here or they just didn't maybe care enough to offer him a contract.
Yeah, there's a couple different ways to think about it. One of them being, yeah, hey, Tim is somebody that you trust. He's the vision setter of the organization. He's the culture setter of the organization, kind of outside of Nikola Jokic and Michael Malone. I think that those guys, those three, are probably the biggest pieces for building up this current iteration of the Nuggets and making sure that they are a championship contender. It's how they've gone about their business, and you want to keep those guys around. You don't necessarily want to have a change in the middle of it, because like it just seems like a terrible idea at this stage of Denver's championship goals, where you're in your most important offseason in franchise history right now.
Right.
You need to get this right. You trust Calvin Booth. I think there's no doubt about that. What's the problem with having Tim Connelly in the room as well? What's the problem with making sure that you have as many smart people in the room as you possibly can to ensure that you put yourself in the best possible way to earn that championship with good decision making? I think that's one way to think about it. But Josh he's reinforced this revolving shark's teeth kind of analogy that he is using with the KSE model, the KSE method, and they do this for all of their teams. They empower smart people. They make sure to give them the resources that they need in order to be successful. But one thing that he did, and he actually did this after Masai left, was he wanted to make sure that there was a second in command at all times that was capable of being able to take over just in case one of their executives was lifted. On one hand, that's pretty smart because it makes sure that you're not going to be completely blindsided by something like this. Because imagine if Calvin Booth had taken a GM job somewhere else last offseason, then Denver would be screwed. Or maybe not. They trust Tommy Balchetis as well, but it's something that they were preparing for. They were preparing for the Tim Connelly departure, which is kind of why I'm a little bit weirded out by the phrasing of we were kind of blindsided by this. They came in through the side door. You were preparing for this. This was the business model. This is how you knew this was going to go. So I'm not even sure if they made the competitive offer that was seemingly spoken about. Like, I do think that there are some crossed wires on this front that should come to light pretty soon.
Yeah, and what does competitive mean? You know what I mean? Like that's my other question with this is, I mean, you can make an $8 million a year offer. Hey, I'll give you 4.5. That's a lot for us.
Here's one for you. Back when Washington was courting Tim Connelly, back in 2019, he was given an offer and then took that offer back to Nuggets ownership, back to Josh Kroenke, and said, hey, this is what they're going to pay me. Can you make a competitive offer to this? They didn't even offer like the same amount of money. What they did was they kind of made up that amount with competitive bonuses, so that like he was going to be paid a lower base salary than what the Washington Wizards were going to offer. And instead they were going to try to make it up with, hey, if we're good, if we're competitive, if you meet certain benchmarks, then you can match or exceed that. I have to imagine that if they won a championship, he would have had an escalator in his contract of some sort that would have paid him more than that. But that's over the Washington Wizards, man. Like most of the teams and when you have an elite GM, when you have an elite person kind of running your basketball operations like Tim is, you usually try to keep them around. Like if somebody went after Bob Myers or Sam Presti or Masai Ujiri in the same way, they'd be laughed off the stage. Right. The fact that Tim Connelly was gettable and was completely gettable, and it was pretty clear that a good offer would win him over, I think that reflects more on the ownership and their methods than on anybody else.
Yeah, and I think, again, just for people to pay attention to that, like the idea that the Warriors would be underpaying like their GM, and then for Bob Myers to get contacted by somebody within the division and a much worse team within the division can come to Bob Myers and say, hey, Golden State Warriors GM, we'll pay you more money, we'll show you more appreciation with this franchise who hasn't won near as much, doesn't have as good of a roster, as good of a player, and we're in the same division that would be like a slap in the face. That's just unconscionable. But because of the way KSC has operated in the Masai Ujiri situation, and I'm not sure with the Artura situation if it was over money. Do you know if that was a money issue or if that was just
No, this was a situation where Arturis had it was a step up. He was going to be able to run the basketball operations for Chicago. Like that was a match made in heaven for him, and it was the right time for him to go at that point. But they knew they had to have Calvin Booth. They signed on Calvin Booth back in 2017 as the number 3 guy, knowing that Arturis was about to go. And so they made sure to then have somebody that could elevate into the number 2.
Right. So now, Josh defended himself and the actions of KSC by saying, look, the Rams just won the Super Bowl. The Avalanche are currently in the Stanley Cups. The teams that we're overseeing, he brought up Arsenal, but that's a whole different thing. And they're not playing well. So he used these examples to say that, hey, like we have a method that's worked. We have a method that has shown fruit even here in this city. So this is what we know what to do. We know we can put people in place to be successful. And then what he followed up essentially throughout that entire conversation, what he said was, for the first time basically in Nuggets history, we are in a championship or bust phase of our organization. So can you even just tell me like your initial thoughts, like when you heard the owner or the presiding owner over the Denver Nuggets when he said that we're in a championship or bust time period with the Denver Nuggets organization?
It's the right time to be able to say it that way. I think that with the last 2 years and the last 2 playoff years kind of they were kind of missing due to injury, I would say. You have to have some championship expectations in this stage of things. The Nuggets made an all-in kind of move when they acquired Aaron Gordon back April 2021. They knew, or March 2021, they knew that this was coming, and this is kind of the next step. They're trying to elevate themselves. They know that they have the talent in order to do it. It's just about putting the right amount of pressure, I think, on everybody to know that this is the time where things have to get done. And actually, it was Michael Malone after the playoffs where he was in his end of season presser and basically said, yeah, we have to have that championship or bust mentality again. Mm-hmm. We knew that this was going to be a lost season. This is Michael Malone speaking here, paraphrasing him. He knew that this was kind of not going to be their best run or their best shot because Jamal was out or maybe just coming back, and Michael Porter was out or maybe just coming back. They weren't going to go all in last year, knowing that those things were happening. But now, kind of after you get some distance from that, you hope that everybody can get back and healthy and on the same page. This is the right time to think about it from a championship caliber perspective.
Right. So now that you mentioned that, you brought up Michael Porter Jr. And Ryan, like I told you, I listened to what you have to say. I listened to your interview recently with who was it? It was Eric Goodman. It was the Morning Drive.
Yeah. It's Eric Goodman and Terry Fry on Mile High Sports Radio.
Right. So let's have this conversation. Because you and I, we sit in a very similar seat when it comes to Michael Porter Jr. I do not like when people come at Michael Porter Jr. because of the contract situation or his back. Like when people say that like he doesn't have like any basketball intelligence, all this other stuff. I'm like, look, man, I think people are just so far disconnected from like what he was prior to going down. And then relatively, he was healthy. Like, if you remember, Ryan, he missed games that year, 2 years ago. It wasn't because of a back. Like, he had an ankle issue, then he had COVID. And I think he missed like 11 games or something like that over the course of that time.
He missed one total game due to back soreness over the course of those 2 years.
Right. So one game over 2 years. So he takes a year off, gets his body right. He comes back. The only reason he didn't play that first year, Ryan, because of the coach's decision, because Coach Michael Malone didn't know if he could trust him in the game. But outside of that, he was cool. And then it took a literal freak injury out of nowhere for him to get hurt right after he signs his contract, and now everybody is counting his pockets. And again, if you're not familiar, everybody out there listening to counting your pockets, that's a colloquialism. And what it means is you worry about another man's money. Here's my thing, Ryan. If Michael Porter Jr., and I'm not saying like an if, like, oh, there's a low chance. Based on the data we have previously that he is not an injury-prone player on a consistent basis, if he comes out this season, Ryan, and he plays 60 games, which is what he's been playing around before that, dude, I mean, you're talking about like having one of the greatest offensive forces in basketball next to the back-to-back MVP, reintegrating Jamal Murray with having Aaron Gordon fully integrated, and then we'll see what happens with the shooting guard spot. Right? I think there's real potential for Michael Porter Jr. healthy to just take off this season because he's had more time to develop his mental game. We know he loves the game. We know he loves basketball. He's going to be healthy. I think people are they're sleeping on what he could be this season.
It's going to be fascinating to see what it looks like because I do think that given this massive injury, given where Denver's kind of at, they're going to need an alternative plan just in case. Like I do think that there's an important plan B that needs to be brought in here. I think that Zeke Naji actually kind of serves as part of that, but not the only guy. I do think that Denver and lots of Nuggets fans were kind of disenfranchised with what Michael Porter did when he played the 8 1/4 games that he did this year and didn't look very good. And the last impression that they had before that was of the Phoenix series. And it was just a really tough situation he was basically a second-year player. Yeah, that Phoenix Suns team, they went to the NBA Finals, and they probably should have gone to the NBA Finals this year, to be honest. Shout out to the Chokers themselves. But no, like I think that.
Wait, Ryan. Just to be fair, Dorian Finney-Smith was a superstar in that series. We got to be fair.
The last time we saw Michael Porter Jr. really find his role, really find his rhythm, was when Jamal Murray was playing really well in kind of that February, March, and early April stage. And you had Jokic, Murray, and Porter averaging 20-plus points per game each. They were each extremely efficient. Those guys knew how to play with each other and could play off of each other. And you had a fourth or a fifth option at those points that were taking fewer shots in general. And you saw what Murray, Porter, and Jokic could do and the kind of havoc that they could wreak on the entire floor from the 28-footers that Murray and Porter were shooting to the at-rim shots that Porter was able to get as a back cutter against smaller players. Jokic and Murray were doing their two-man dance. Everything was coming together from an offensive perspective with those three. And then Murray went down. So I think a lot of people, they don't know what it means for Porter to be a third option again, what it means for him to have a little bit less pressure in general. Jokic is better than he ever was. Like he's way better than he was at that point in 2021. I think Murray will come back and he'll be rusty, but he's ultimately going to be better too. I have no doubt about that. Porter's going to be better too. He's going to be smarter. He's going to know how to play. It's going to take a little bit of an adjustment period, but I'm with you, man. Like as long as they can stay on the court for a reasonable amount of time and get to a playoffs, like I think that this team has as much talent as anybody.
Yeah, and I think people, like one of the common misnomers about MPJ is like they say that the Nuggets aren't a good defensive team when he's out there. Not true. They actually are a better defensive team when he's on the court because he's by far their best at-the-rim defender and their best weak-side help defender on that team. Obviously with Aaron Gordon because he's on ball. But MPJ was taking significant leaps defensively over the course of that year prior to that injury. And I mean, even this year, before I say this year because we're still in the finals, but obviously the Nuggets have been done for a month now. But when they played against Phoenix to open the season off, I remember I had noticed he made strides at a playmaker that opening that game versus the Suns. And it seemed like he had consciously went into the offseason saying, I need to be a better on-ball creator, not just for myself, but for my teammates. But then again, he got hurt seemingly in preseason versus the Golden State Warriors at treacherous Oracle Arena. But I just think that he has the potential to take some serious leap. Now, to your point, I'm not going to lie, Ryan, I don't think that Jeff Green is going to be the best option to say that, hey, Jeff Green, can we get 40 games out of you? Maybe if we don't get Porter this year. And so you're right. Maybe Zeke Naji gets to nod there, and maybe they bring in somebody else to be the wing. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's to be talked about with this. But I just think people just have to take a little bit of a pause with Porter, that people are so down on that contract and they're so down on the extension. But all of that changes. Like all of it changes if Porter is able to play 60-plus games again, which he has already done. And then everything is different. Then now you're literally having a player who shot 65% true shooting from the perimeter in his second year in the NBA on volume. So once again, it's just one of those things. So, right, for you, there are some serious things that the Denver Nuggets need to address. There's some things that Calvin Booth, he's talked about this as well, that things that need to be addressed. And obviously we have the draft and stuff coming up. So for you, if you had like a short list of a few things that you would like to see accomplished over the next few months of the offseason, from a free agency standpoint and a draft standpoint leading into the 2022 NBA season, what would be some of the things that you would like to see addressed by the Denver Nuggets?
I think the first thing, if you're picking out, because there are a lot of different ways that you can go. If you've got a foundation that includes Murray, Porter, Gordon, Jokic, like there's a lot of different ways that you can build a team and still be successful. The one that really stands out with some of the other personnel that they have Bones, they have Monte, they have Barton. They don't really have perimeter defense. That's probably the biggest area where you saw some weaknesses against the Golden State Warriors. You saw some weaknesses against the Phoenix Suns and even against the Portland Trailblazers before that. Like the fact that Denver was able to win that series was a miracle in and of itself. But I do think that's if you're going to address anything, Denver's going to have to find some foundational perimeter defenders. And what I mean by that, Austin Rivers was brought in off the street to make sure that he could kind of like satisfy some of the numbers kind of left by Jamal Murray. He wasn't brought in to be a defender. Like he was just brought in to be a scorer. That was what his role was going to be. And as it turned out, his best role for Denver was as a perimeter guy. And it's like he was adaptable and very successful in that, but he's not a great defender in and of itself. Denver needs to find great defenders. They need guys who can specialize on that side of the floor and make things easier for the stars around them. That's where you kind of have to relieve some tension. Is Jokic has to do so much on the offensive end. You don't want to make him do so much on the defensive end too. Murray's coming back from an injury. You don't want to make him chase around a whole bunch of stars when he's coming back and just trying to get his sea legs under him again. Same thing with Porter, honestly. You want to make it so that those guys can have a little bit of an easier transition back into the starting lineup, making sure that they're ready to go by the playoffs, obviously. But you got to get perimeter defense. Probably comes at the starting two. That's where I would say that has to be solved. I don't think that Will Barton is the answer there. And I've been a Will Barton defender for a long time. I'm pretty vocally online because I think that he doesn't get enough respect. But I also can acknowledge that he probably isn't the right fit for the Denver Nuggets right now. And that's okay. He's a good player who might be very successful in another spot. But for Denver, they've got to get a perimeter defender at that spot.
Yeah, and I guess this goes back to, for you, and I think this is a good, like, kind of a question of, like, perspective. We went from the Gary Harris, Torrey Craig, Paul Millsap kind of foundational pieces defensively. And in 2018-19 season, they actually had a top 10 defense. They had a number one defense for a while, but then they had a top 10 defense to close that year. But they went away from that, and they replaced Torrey Craig, Paul Millsap, and Gary Harris with basically like Facundo Campazzo, Jeff Green, and Jermichael Green. So, like, what do you think that, like, the philosophical, like, shift was? Like, why do you think they went away from some of these more defensive-minded players and went to some players like a Facu? You know, Bones got drafted. It's not really a bone, but even like Jeff Green and Jermichael Green and some others, like, why do you think there might have been a little bit of a transition from, like, what they had been doing that had let them be successful to what they became now in the last couple of the seasons, especially in the playoffs?
It's a good question. I think a lot of folks in the front office were undervaluing that side of the game, undervaluing the defensive man-on-man and maybe even some versatility and some athleticism on that front. I think that was kind of undervalued in these discussions. And so I think PJ Dozier was somebody that they were counting on, that they were hoping would be successful in that kind of role. And he was a fantastic defender when he was healthy. There is no doubt about it in my mind that he could have stepped up into that role. And they got unlucky. Like he tore his ACL. That's awful. And it was terrible at the time, and it really kind of ruined Denver's wing depth. But they didn't address that position adequately. And when you see Porter go down, when you see PJ Dozier go down, Denver has added, and I think what they, like with Murray out, they also really focused on having some on-ball creators. And some of those guys are just naturally going to be smaller. Some of those guys, point guards, smaller shooting guard types, guys that can handle the ball and be creative with it. They knew that they needed to keep Will Barton. because Jamal Murray was going to be out. And
Right.
now that you think Jamal Murray's coming back, now you think you've got some different goals as opposed to just getting through the regular season. Now you've got to get through the postseason. And you can't do that without perimeter defense. So I do think that had Tim stayed around, like he gets a lot of flack for not filling out the wing position, for
Right.
kind of defaulting away from those kinds of guys. But I do think that had he come back, he would have addressed that ad nauseum this offseason. It just sort of comes down to perspective there.
You know what's so interesting about what you just said, which is why I love talking basketball with Ryan Blackburn. Go follow Ryan Blackburn on Twitter. So my thing is, but look at the Boston Celtics. Look at the Golden State Warriors. How many on-ball creators do they actually have? Like, what are the things about their team that actually make them elite? Obviously, Steph Curry, elite on-ball creator. You have Jordan Poole. And you listen to Warriors fans, they will tell you Jordan Poole is probably the second best on-ball creator they've had in the entire Golden State era. Again, not counting the top 15 player of all time, super freak, 7-foot Kevin Durant. We're not counting him. That's Thanos. They put Thanos on their team. Thanos joined the Avengers and then went against the Guardian of the Galaxy in the NBA championship, and everybody was surprised they won. Of course they're going to win with Thanos. So
I love it.
I think like the Boston Celtics, I mean, Marcus Smart's not a traditional point guard. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't even like his playmaking ability. It really bothers me, the decision-making he had. Derek White, not an on-ball creator. I mean, really, it's Jason Tatum and then Pritchard, but they don't really have that. But they specialized in, we're going to have defensive versatility to the max. To the max. The Golden State Warriors, Otto Porter, not an on-ball creator. Gary Payton II, not an on-ball creator. Draymond Green, not an on-ball creator. He's a great playmaker, can't create on-ball. Klay Thompson, mid-level on-ball creator, but in his prime, elite defender, especially on the perimeter. Off-ball, he would get lost sometimes, but on-ball, he's very good. But what I'm saying is, like, the teams that are in the finals right now, they're not heavy on all-ball playmakers, but they're heavy on defensive versatility, switchability, and shooting. So, Ryan, I think that goes back to my fundamental question. What is it about, like, the Nuggets that you already had Murray, you already had Porter, and you already had Jokic? I'm not going to lie to you. You don't need more offense than that. I mean, you already have a generational offensive piece in Jokic, who I argue is the best offensive big man in the NBA in NBA history. I think he also has an argument to be the greatest offensive engine in NBA history. But then you look at Jamal Murray and Porter, but if you really, I think in my mind, if you surround them with elite role players who know their role on defense, especially Aaron Gordon, I think can maybe transform into that to some level. I think if you just put those kind of players to athletes that just are able to fill some of those gaps, right, I think that's a championship team. That's just me, though.
It's going to be interesting to see how they approach it, because this team is definitely more geared towards offensive success, right? You've got Monte Morris, you've got Bones Highland. Jeff Green is more of an offensive guy rather than a defensive guy, I would say, with what he can do more as a stretch five or a playmaking five kind of. But they've got a lot of guys, I think, that can help make them an elite offensive team. And Will Barton kind of falls into this category as well, as more offensive geared versus defensive geared. But you're right. Like a lot of the success that teams have had over the course of these last few years, you look at the Suns last year, you look at the Bucks last year. I think they were 1 and 2 in playoff defense, respective. Or I think the Bucks were number 1 at that point last year. Right. And this year, you've got the Warriors and the Celtics, who were the number 1 and number 2 regular season defenses. So the defense is going to travel, and any team that is capable of playing defense in this pace and space, extremely high skilled era, like all those guys are going to be like, they're going to separate themselves pretty clearly. I don't know if Denver's ever going to be able to get to that level, because like I think Jokic has his limits. Like he's not going to be Robert Williams as a defender. And that's fine. Like there are different things, and like you said, he's the greatest offensive hub that we've ever seen from the big man position. So it's not really a slight. But I do think that they're going to need to kind of compensate with that by adding better perimeter talent from a defensive standpoint, and guys that can be switchable, guys that can be capable of making plays. They haven't had enough defensive playmakers on their team, which is why that's probably the way that I would go if it's in the draft, if it's in free agency with a trade. I think you got to find some defensive playmakers, not just guys that are fundamentally sound, although those would be helpful too.
Right. Yeah, and I just think people, again, this is just my perspective on basketball. I could be completely wrong, Ryan, so I'm always open for criticism there. I just think that when you have offensive talent like this, when LeBron was in his heyday with Cleveland in his later years, I mean, he was surrounded by like George Hill, Jeff Green. I mean, obviously you had Kyrie and Kevin Love, but they weren't there in the 2017-18 season. It was defensive players. I mean, it was Amon Shumpert and J.R. Smith. None of them were like elite offensive players. That dude made Jeff Green so valuable. They were able to go into Boston and win in 7 in the Eastern Conference Finals, one of the greatest playoff runs I've ever seen in my life. So I think that Joker has moved into this echelon where he's like, all right, I'm an all-NBA player, and then last year he's an MVP winner, and then this year he moved into like, oh, psych, I'm going to actually shoot 65% from 2. I'm going to shoot 60% from 3 to 10. I'm going to shoot 53% from the mid-range. I'm going to be basically the best playmaker in the NBA. And there's nothing you can do about it. I'm going to shoot 78% at the rim as well. So my whole thing is like, all right, he had a 63% true shooting versus the Golden State Warriors in the first round. The last 3 games, he averaged 35, 15, and 6. And he has a 73%, Ryan, I don't know if you heard me say this, 73% true shooting the last 3 games. If you just give him adequate defenders in that series, he could have beat Golden State over those last couple of games with just that. If they would have had some people stepping up defensively, and they did. They got better defensively as the series going on. But Ryan, again, as you can see, this stuff makes me emotional because I actually really care about this. I love this part of basketball. Like, Ryan, when I watch the Boston Celtics, and you look at what Marcus Smart is doing at that point, you're talking about the defensive playmaking. Like, do you remember when we went to Boston and the Nuggets played them early in the year? And then you saw Marcus Smart. I think Jokic had like 5 to 6 turnovers in the first quarter. A lot of that
it was directly to Marcus Smart. He was stealing every pass. It was crazy.
So can you even explain that? Like when you say defensive versatility, just for the audience, like not versatility, but defensive playmaking, like what does that mean to you, like as an analyst?
Yeah, to me, like I've started to kind of craft this theory that when you're playing defense in the NBA, you want guys that are going to be able to cover as much area, whether it's vertically or horizontally, as possible, to try to prevent as many shots, to try to disrupt as many shots as you possibly can. And your defensive playmakers are the guys that have such a wide area that they can cover that they can kind of make up for a lot of your mistakes. And sometimes it's not like you have your fundamental guys, and if you have 5 capable defenders, then you should be able to cover most of the area. Now, right. Great offense, it trumps great defense, that's for sure. And you'll see guys like Steph Curry kind of capitalize on that with the limited space that they need to get shots off. But you also see guys like Marcus Smart, who is a defensive playmaker himself, be able to jump those passing lanes, be able to draw some charges, really get up into the airspace of somebody and make their life absolute hell. And you know when you see it, because you feel those guys as an offensive player, knowing that they are in your airspace and around you, and just you get a little bit concerned, or at least wary of what they're going to do.
Grant Williams coming off the
bench. When they're not thinking about scoring and they're thinking about you, then you've done your job. And so you get these ball hawks like a DeJounte Murray or like a Kyle Lowry who's taking charges every single time. You're thinking about Kyle Lowry jumping into the lane. There's no doubt about it. And it's one of the reasons why he's one of the best defenders out there. But there's a lot of guys, and there's a lot of different ways to be a defensive playmaker. The best way, in my mind, is to get guys with long arms that are athletic, that can switch and can jump passing lanes. That's probably the best way to do it, and the most reasonable way to do it if you're Denver. Right. But there are other ways too.
By the way, y'all, I don't know what Ryan Blackburn's Cash App is, but you might as well fill that out because that man just dropped the defensive nugget on you. Defensive playmaking. When's the last time y'all heard that term used? Never. Never. Y'all ain't heard that used ever. So here's my thing. I'm going to put some people out here, and I want to hear your opinions. I want you to give me maybe some of your favorites you would like to see the different Nuggets add. This is going to be our last segment. So here are my 3 guys, right? I'm going to say 4. Some people don't like one of them because he's not like always like great on ball. Matisse Thybulle. Now, a lot of Philly people don't like Matisse Thybulle because they think Matisse gambles way too much. But to your point, he's excellent at playing behind the player. He's excellent playing off ball. Like, he's really good. No offensive game whatsoever. He basically is like Andre Roberson or Thabo Cephalosha, like on offense. So, like, you're not getting anything from that. But I think Matisse Thybulle. I love Josh Hart. You probably heard me talk about the Josh Hart love affair I've had. I think Lou Dort, and I think DeJounte Murray. What do you think about those four? And maybe who would be some people that you realistically would like to see the Denver Nuggets make a serious headway on trying to add to the team?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a great list, and there's a number of people that are on that list that I think that could be gettable this offseason, depending on what actually happens. But I'm very curious how Matisse Thybulle is viewed around the NBA, because I still view him as one of the elite defenders in the NBA. He's clearly an elite defender in my mind, despite the fact that he has some weaknesses, that he has some, I think, areas where he could probably improve. But there's no doubt that if you're talking about defensive playmakers, he's one of the best at it. He gets steals and blocks out the wazoo. He is a guy who could, like, if you're looking for, if you think that the Nuggets have enough offense to cover up for defensive or for guys with offensive weaknesses, then Matisse Thybulle is a potential buy low candidate that everybody should be thinking about right now.
Right.
I'd be a little bit like, there are some things like, you want Jokic players to have some versatility. You want them to be able to do some stuff. But if you've got one guy who can't, you could probably make up for that. There's probably some ways to do it. You mentioned Josh Hart. He's on the list too. He could be a very capable starting two guard next to Murray, next to Porter. He's got that versatility. That's probably the name of his game specifically, where he doesn't necessarily, like, he's not the best on-ball guy. He's not the best off-ball guy, but he does both things pretty well at a pretty solid level. And then he's probably the best offensive guy among sort of the 3-and-D type wings that you could potentially get. Like, he's probably the best one there. You mentioned DeJounte Murray. I don't think he's necessarily gettable. And I'm very curious to see what San Antonio is going to end up doing here in this draft, because they've got max cap space. They've got 3 first-round picks. DeJounte is not necessarily on the timeline for when they're probably going to be at their best. But I do think that, like, if he is gettable, then there are very few players that are better that are on the market as a trade candidate that would fit as well as he would in Denver. Like, he's probably the pinnacle of what you could get as a starting guard next to Jamal Murray. DeJounte Murray takes on all the tough assignments at that point, and then Jamal kind of works his way back into the swing of things at that point. Who was the fourth name that you mentioned?
Had Lou Dort.
Lou Dort. I'm a little bit wary of Lou Dort because I think he's a little bit too small for what they need. I think that if you're Denver, the best way that you can build a competent defense now is to add those lengthy athletes and guys that can switch. And especially, let's say you have questions about Porter being healthy. Let's say you have questions about, if Porter's out, how do you score at the 3? What is the guy that you replace him with? I think you probably need somebody at the shooting guard position who's about 6'6" or so, maybe 6'5" on the small end. Lou Dort's even smaller than that. I don't think you can reasonably trust him to defend a bunch of 3s, because with Denver's ideal scheme, you'd probably want that guy to be able to switch onto some 4s too. So you want somebody who can be very highly versatile and know what they have to do on all of those positions and be able to do a little bit of everything. That would be my ideal. And I also think that if you're Denver, you've already got Jamal, you've got Monte Morris and Bones Highland. Adding Lou Dort as another kind of small guard might be a little bit too much.
Right. What do you think in terms of draft wise? You have a guy like, somewhat biased, but Jeremy Shokin. I don't know if you remember him from Baylor. He's the power forward from Baylor. I mean, he's probably the guy almost like my Herb Jones love affair a little bit. Like, he's just so long, so tall, like a very mobile athlete. Is there a guy in the draft that you like a lot?
Jeremy Sohan's interesting. He's definitely. I think if you're drafting somebody like him, you're profiling him as a power forward. You're profiling him as somebody that he's not necessarily going to have a bunch of offensive responsibility, but he can switch 1 through 5, can be a really helpful connecting piece. And I'm not sure that's what Denver needs right now, at least if you're going to get some, because he's not going to drop to 21. I don't think there's any way. Right. He's really talented, to be clear, but you probably have to get into the top 10, 12, 14 picks in order to get him. As far as guys that could potentially fall to 21, I think Jalen Williams is the guy that I have circled. He's a just under 6'6", small or shooting guard, small forward type on the wing. 7'2" wingspan out of Santa Clara. He can shoot, pass, dribble, and defend. Like there are like parts of his game where he looks like a starting point guard. There are parts of his game where he looks like a big wing scorer. He can do a whole bunch of different things, and a little bit undervalued throughout most of the season. I think that he's probably properly valued now. I have a lottery grade on him personally, but I do think that he could fall to 21. I don't think that there's no doubt that he could fall to 21 because he was mocked in the second round like a couple weeks ago. So he's somebody that I would circle. Marjan Beauchamp is another guy. G League Ignite kind of player, 6'7", kind of like what I was talking about with the versatile defensive athlete types. He's got a 7-foot wingspan himself. Not as much of an offensive guy as I think Jalen Williams is going to be, but Marjan Beauchamp is clearly a good athlete and a versatile athlete, somebody who could do a lot of different things on ball and off ball defensively. And then Wendell Moore Jr. is the third guy that I would list. Duke wing, 6'5", 7-foot wingspan. Just a lot of these guys that I'm looking at, long arms. That's right. What you're looking for. Guys that can defend on the ball and guys that can get their hands into passing lanes. He is a guy who has probably the most versatile offensive game of any of them. Can play both on and off the ball. Really does act like a point guard at times for that Duke team this past year. And he was undervalued, I think, because his first 2 seasons at Duke were very underwhelming. This past year, I think it was fantastic. And he showed a lot of what I would want if I were drafting a role player, which I think is what Denver should be going for. Mm-hmm. But I do think he has like 3rd, 4th option upside.
Okay. Well, if you need any more NBA draft information, y'all know where to go. I know he does extensive work on that. And so, Ryan, I just want to say thank you for making the time to come on here and talk. We celebrate you. We celebrate your new accomplishment with being with Mile High Sports. We celebrate all the work that you've done, all the work that you will continue to do, and the great service that you are for the entire Nuggets community. So deeply appreciate you making time for this episode, my brother.
Thank you, my friend. It's been awesome. You do some fantastic work here. I look forward to being on the show again around draft time because I have no doubts that there's going to be some fireworks, whether it's draft, free agency, trades. The Nuggets, they're going to do a whole bunch of crazy stuff. And I'm just along the ride for it.
Man, hey, y'all, make sure y'all subscribe to the channel. Go follow Ryan Blackburn on Twitter. Man, great stuff, man. Hey, we're going to see y'all soon.